From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We are the voice of the animals. We are the voice of the trees because they don't have the voice. Creator to us gave us stewardship over the land, so that's what we're doing. We are fighting for clean water, for future generations, for Mother Earth, for the world.
People versus fossil fuels. Over 530 people have been arrested in Washington in a historic week of indigenous-led civil disobedience, calling on President Biden to declare a climate emergency and stop approving fossil fuel projects. On Thursday, dozens of indigenous activists occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs for the first time since the 1970s. We will get the latest and speak to two indigenous activists arrested this week. Then we look at the humanitarian crisis unfolding in the world's largest jail complex. It's Rikers Island in New York, in one of the richest cities in the world. This as the New York governor starts transferring women and transgender people held there, most of them awaiting trial, to a maximum security prison.
It's unbelievable, and it's unacceptable. Women should not be transferred from one hellhole to another hellhole.
We'll speak to a leader of the Halt Solitary campaign who was once held at Rikers, and to New York City public advocate Jumaane Williams, who toured the jail and says it's the worst he's ever seen. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Afghanistan, a massive explosion at a Shia mosque in Kandahar has killed at least 32 people during Friday prayers and injured scores of others, according to local officials. The blast came 1 week after an explosion at a mosque in Kunduz killed at least 72 people. That attack was claimed by the Islamic State in Khorasan province, known as ISIS-K. In other news from Afghanistan, the U.S. said it will resume regular evacuation flights before the end of the year to get remaining U.S. citizens, residents, and qualifying visa applicants out of Afghanistan. Lebanon is observing a national day of mourning 1 day after a pitched gun battle in Beirut left 7 people dead and injured at least 32 others. Hezbollah blamed snipers with an armed Christian faction for firing on Shia marchers who were protesting an ongoing probe into last year's deadly blast at the port of Beirut. On Thursday evening, Lebanese President Michel Aoun promised to hold the attackers accountable.
Armed forces did their duty and will continue to do so and maintain security and stability and civil rest. We will not allow anyone to take the country hostage to their own interests.
A meeting of the World Trade Organization's Intellectual Property Council ended Thursday without action on a proposal to suspend patent rights on COVID-19 vaccines. The United Kingdom and some wealthy European Union nations, led by Germany, continue to oppose a patent waiver, which was first proposed over a year ago by India and South Africa and backed by over 100 WTO member nations. Since then, the world's recorded over 3.8 million COVID-19 deaths. Here in the United States, a Food and Drug Administration advisory panel is recommending a third shot of Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine for people 65 and older, as well as those at high risk of severe disease and workers in high-risk professions. The recommendation came even as many scientists questioned whether the protection conferred by Moderna's vaccine is waning. Today, the FDA panel will weigh whether people who've received Johnson & Johnson vaccines should get a second dose and whether it might be advantageous to mix and match vaccines. President Biden welcomed Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta to the White House on Thursday for talks in the Oval Office. It was the first time President Biden has hosted an African leader. The meeting came just days after a massive leak of secret documents known as the Pandora Papers revealed President Kenyatta and his relatives stashed more than $30 million of wealth in offshore tax havens, including in Panama. In Chile, opposition lawmakers have launched impeachment proceedings against President Sebastián Piñera over possible irregularities in the 2010 sale of a mining company that's partially owned by Piñera's children. The revelations emerged in the Pandora Papers leak detailing how the company, named Dominga, was sold for $138 million to an offshore firm run by a Chilean businessman and a close friend of Piñera's. Chile's public prosecutor last week announced a probe into the sale, citing possible tax and bribery-related violations. One lawmaker said, quote, Chile does not deserve to have a president like Piñera. A coalition of immigrant and racial justice organizations have filed a civil rights lawsuit denouncing immigration and customs enforcement's brutal assaults against African asylum seekers. The complaint details incidents that took place before or during deportation flights to Cameroon in October and November of last year. ICE officers are accused of placing asylum seekers in 5-point shackles and further immobilizing them in a device called the WRAP. For hours. The coalition, which includes the Undocu Black Network and the Cameroon Advocacy Network, released this video along with a lawsuit that was filed on behalf of 3 asylum seekers.
The WRAP is intended for use in extreme situations. It is designed to restrain people in a seated position. Instead, the WRAP was used against these Black migrants, who were already restrained, to lock them into painful stress positions, with one man forced into a full-face hood. This is torture, as the United Nations has made clear.
One of the Cameroonian asylum seekers in the complaint said he has asthma and couldn't breathe while he was placed in the WRAP. He said, quote, I truly felt I was meeting my death in that moment. Another asylum seeker suffers from a heart condition and reported experiencing chest pain after being restrained in the device. Fresh calls to ban police use of tear gas came Thursday after the House Oversight Committee released a memo noting the U.S. government does not regulate the chemical weapon and never found it to be safe for use on humans. In spite of this, law enforcement regularly deploys tear gas on civilians and did so in at least 100 U.S. cities in the first 6 months of 2020 alone. The memo also notes that tear gas is banned from use in war as a chemical weapon by international treaty. Missouri Congressmember Cori Bush said in a statement, quote, for protest to truly be a right, we must ensure that we are never again met with weapons of war on our streets. A federal appeals court has ruled to keep Texas's near-total ban on abortions in place. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals extended a stay on a federal judge's ruling last week that blocked the ban, deeming it unconstitutional. The 2 judges on the 3-judge panel who voted Thursday to keep the law in place were appointed by George W. Bush and Donald Trump. In other news from Texas, a top administrator with the Carroll Independent School District in South Lake has come under fire for telling teachers they should offer students books with, quote, opposing perspectives on the Holocaust. Gina Petty is the district's executive director of curriculum and instruction. In a recording obtained by NBC News, Petty advises teachers how to comply with Texas' new state law, House Bill 3979, which requires them to present multiple perspectives about, quote, widely debated and currently controversial issues.
As you go through, just try to remember the concepts of 3979 and make sure that if you have a book on the Holocaust, that you have one that has opposing, that has other.
How do you oppose the Holocaust?
Texas Governor Greg Abbott has praised House Bill 3979 as a, quote, strong move to abolish critical race theory. A warning to our audience, the next stories feature descriptions of rape and violence against women. In New Jersey, actor and visual artist Lily Bernard sued Bill Cosby Thursday, accusing the disgraced actor of drugging and raping her in 1990. Bernard has spoken publicly about her case, but until recently was not able to file a suit due to New Jersey's statute of limitations. A reform enacted in 2019 opened a 2-year window to bring cases of sexual assault regardless of when they happened. Bernard says Cosby was her mentor and promised to help help prepare her for a guest-starring role on The Cosby Show when he drugged and assaulted her at the Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City. 60 survivors have accused Bill Cosby of sexual assault, but he was released from jail in June after a court overturned his conviction on a technicality. To see our interviews with Lily Bernard and more on the case, go to democracynow.org. In Kenya, police have arrested the husband of record-breaking runner Agnes Tirop, one day after the celebrated athlete was found stabbed to death in her home. 25-year-old Agnes Tirop broke a long-distance running record just last month and was a two-time World Championship bronze medalist. She also participated in the Tokyo Olympics. The Congressional Committee investigating the January 6th insurrection is set to recommend criminal charges against Donald Trump's campaign advisor and senior political strategist Steve Bannon. Bannon missed a Thursday deadline on a congressional subpoena requiring him to testify and hand over documents related to the assault on the U.S. Capitol. Steve Bannon's legal team cited Trump's claims of executive privilege. The White House says President Biden will be joined by 13 cabinet members and other senior officials next month at the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow. The crucial United Nations talks come after UN scientists warn the planet is on course for a catastrophic global temperature rise of 2.7 degrees Celsius unless nations sharply increase their stated goals for cutting emissions. And in Scotland, a climate justice advocate is being praised for bravely confronting Shell CEO Ben van Beurden during a TED event in Edinburgh Thursday. Lauren MacDonald is a campaigner for a Green New Deal rising. She and van Beurden appeared on a TED Countdown Summit panel together that was described by its organizers as a forum where speakers would share a blueprint for a beautiful net zero future. Tickets for the four-day event were between $10,000 and $50,000. These were some of MacDonald's remarks.
No matter what he says today, remember, Shell has spent millions covering up the warnings from climate scientists, bribing politicians and even paying soldiers to kill Nigerian activists fighting against them. All whilst rebranding to make it look as though they care and that they have the intention of changing. Disproportionately, in the Global South, so many people are already dying due to issues related to the climate crisis, such as pollution, extreme heat, and weather-related disasters. This is not an abstract issue, and you are directly responsible for those deaths. We will never forget what you have done and what Shell has done. I hope you know that.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. After break, we go to people versus fossil fuels. More than 500 people have been arrested in Washington, D.C., and in historic indigenous-led civil disobedience. Stay with us. Captain Planet Remix by Luzmila Carpio. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Washington, D.C., where over 530 climate activists have been arrested in a historic week of civil disobedience, calling on President Biden to declare a climate emergency and stop approving fossil fuel projects. The indigenous-led protests have been part of a mobilization dubbed People versus Fossil Fuels. On Thursday, indigenous activists occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs for the first time since the 1970s. Indigenous leaders issued a series of demands, including the abolition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, restoration of 110 million acres of land taken away from Native nations, the return of Indigenous children buried at residential schools, and no new leases for oil and gas or extractive industries on public lands. 55 people involved in the takeover were arrested. Indigenous activists have also been leading daily acts of civil disobedience outside the White House. This is a member of the Red Lakes in Minnesota speaking Monday.
We are the voice of the animals. We are the voice of the trees because they don't have the voice. Creator to us gave us stewardship over the land, so that's what we're doing. We are fighting for clean water for future generations, for Mother Earth, for the world.
Indigenous youth activists are scheduled to lead a march to the U.S. Capitol today. This week's protests in D.C. come just weeks before the start of the critical UN climate summit in Glasgow, Scotland. CNN's reporting President Biden's planning to attend along with 13 cabinet members in the first week. But U.S. climate envoy John Kerry's already admitting the talks will likely fail to reach a global target on cutting greenhouse gas emissions. During a protest outside the White House Monday, Joy Braun of the Indigenous Environmental Network called on President Biden to uphold promises made to Indigenous communities.
You need to be held accountable. You made promises to the Indigenous communities across this land that you were going to uphold, but you haven't upheld those promises. You've been speaking with a forked tongue, just like that one that was before you.
That was Joy Braun speaking Monday outside the White House. She's joining us now in Washington. She's a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe and a frontline community organizer with the Indigenous Environmental Network. She was deeply involved in the Standing Rock protests to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. And we're joined by Sikinik Malpan, the executive director of Sovereign Utopia for a Living Arctic. She lives in Fairbanks, Alaska. She was arrested yesterday during the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and that's where we're going to begin. Sikinik, can you talk about this protest? We didn't know if we'd have you on the show today because we didn't know if you were going to be getting out of jail, but we got word last night that you were.
Yes, we had gathered to let Biden know that we're not going anywhere. Signing petitions and giving them and following these laws have not gotten us where we need to be. There is a climate emergency. People are dying right now, and we needed to make a statement, and I think that we did.
So talk about what you're demanding of the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
The BIA was created to erase Indigenous people. It has always been against us. And today or yesterday and every day we demand that it be abolished. We do not need a blood quantum to say how Indigenous we are or to qualify that. We know our Indigenous ways to protect this land, this earth, this water, and we understand that the earth is unbalanced, and we do not have time for negotiations, for compromises. We need to take this serious and take action now.
Can you talk about what happened in August when your group, along with others, were able to get the U.S. District Court Judge Sharon Gleason to throw out the approvals of a major oil project in your state of Alaska?
Yes, that was a extraordinary time, considering during the heart of the pandemic in 2020, the Bureau of Land Management decided to hold the hearings for opening the Willow Master Project located outside of Nuiqsut, where my mother lives and my family is from. And we heard testimony from tribal administrators, corporation presidents, Native corporation presidents begging the Bureau of Land Management to stop these hearings until the pandemic was over, until we got it under control. And they quite literally did not listen. You can just hear sobbing. And they continued on. They made the record of decision, and it felt a little hopeless, especially with Biden's approval of this project, even though he promised he was going to take the climate crisis serious. So having the Ninth Circuit overthrow this was such a big win, especially when the corruption is so rampant within our government.
Can you talk about specifically your action yesterday? I think it was reported some 55 water protectors were arrested and taken from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And to talk about how significant this is, the last time it was occupied was by Native Americans in the 1970s. On November 3rd, 1972, a group of 500 American Indians with the American Indian Movement took over the interior building, the culmination of a cross-country journey that was called the Trail of Broken Treaties, intended to bring attention to Native American issues such as living standards and treaty rights. Why did you focus on the BIA? Are you calling for it to be disbanded?
Yes, and we wanted to make a statement that we are still here. We have been fighting against the genocide of our people, colonization since contact, and we are not going away. We came with matriarchs that led us, and that was, I think, a powerful statement to have our women come in front again and to lead us into that building. I followed their guidance, and we were able to, again, make a statement at the BIA organization created to quite literally erase us from this place, this earth, with Blood Quantum. We do demand the abolishment of BIA, and to also say that Indigenous people have always been the caretakers of this land, and we will continue to be the caretakers.
I want to bring Joy Braun into this conversation, a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, frontline community organizer with Indigenous Environmental Network, which organized this week of historic protest. I dare say, with President Biden now saying he and 13 members of his cabinet are going to go to the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow, may well be a result of what you all have done this week right outside the White House. We last talked to you, Joy, at the standoff at Standing Rock. Can you talk about the organizing of this week, what's happened, and what you want to see come out of it? You, along with over 500 people like Sicknick, have been arrested.
Hi, it's good to be on the show again and to see you today. Well, I certainly hope that President Biden is listening. The United States government brought the front lines to us, to the Indigenous people, to our doorsteps, and we wanted to bring the front lines to his doorstep to let him see that we are very serious about climate change and declaring a climate emergency. People versus Fossil Fuels came out of Build Back Fossil Free, a coalition of over 200 frontline organizations around the United States that came together and said, we're not being heard. We're not being listened to. And we have to unite. We need to unite together to let this administration know that we are serious. And, we're tired. We go to all the hearings, we do the petitions, we make the phone calls, and it's not working. They're still allowing pipelines to go through illegally. Dakota Access Pipeline is still an illegal pipeline. And, of course, they did not do a full EIS on Line 3, and they're ignoring treaty rights on Line 5 and Mountain Valley Pipeline.
Joy, these protests are historic. You knew people who back in the 1970s were part of that AIM takeover, the American Indian Movement takeover of the Bureau of Indian Affairs?
I was a little kid back in the 1970s, so that I was maybe 3 years old. So I was just a toddler at that time. But we definitely heard about those times. And we did have elders with us this week who were part of that particular movement in the 70s. What happened this time again was organic. There was no leadership. It was just the people saying that we need to go and make a statement that the Bureau of Indian Affairs has, it only was designed to eliminate us, like my new daughter, because we like to adopt children, like my new daughter, Sicknick, has said. We need to erase Blood Quantum. What other people in the world must still carry a card saying what percentage of blood you are, like a horse or a dog. I mean, that's crazy. So, plus, the DOI did give 2,500 new oil and gas leases on BLM property when President Biden said, we're going to stop all new leases, but then opens it back up, and then also threatens the Arctic with new leases and the Gulf Coast, of course, with new leases and new LNG projects.
Can you describe some of the other actions, Joy, that have been taking place in Washington? For example, the Andrew Jackson statue in Lafayette Park across the street from the White House was the words "expect us" were written across it. What did that mean?
Well, it came out of respect us or expect us. And that is a saying that was said, many, many times over the years during the fight, from the 1970s and the 80s and the 90s. It was something that one of my mentors, Deb Whiteplume, used to say. And, of course, I said it at Standing Rock when we were at treaty camp. But I woke up, like many people, and saw the redecoration of that statue. Jackson was the one that caused mass genocide to indigenous people. I mean, tens of thousands of indigenous people died at his hands, and, of course, started the Trail of Tears for many tribes, including the Cherokee.
Earlier this week, protesters climbed a flagpole outside the Army Corps of Engineers office, demanding a stop to the Line 3 crude oil pipeline.
Yes, I was there. 2 flagpoles were climbed by indigenous activists, and the flags became coup presents. We kind of grabbed and nabbed them. But, that's kind of something that we would have done if we were in battle. We'd like to go grab the enemy's flag. So that's what happened.
Yet at the same time, you have the first Indigenous, the first Native American cabinet member to be named under, and this was under President Biden, Deb Haaland, who is a former Congress member from New Mexico. She is the Interior Secretary. Now, according to AP, she was not in the Interior Department's building where the BIA is, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, on Thursday. But can you talk about her role and if you've had conversations with her?
Well, of course, different organizations have been trying to reach out to who we call Auntie Deb. We love Auntie Deb. Make no doubt about it. We love Auntie Deb. We love that she was appointed by President Biden. We love that she's been able to get some really good positive work done. However, her hands have been tied by the Biden administration when it comes to climate change. Like I said, the DOI allowed 2,500 new oil and gas leases, when President Biden could have said, we're going to stop them and we're not going to allow this to happen. In order for us to truly make a climate change in the world, in order for us to say, hey, we are leaders in climate, then we must stop all new oil and gas infrastructure, especially on public lands. And unfortunately, Auntie Deb hasn't been able to do those types of things because her hands are tied by the Biden administration's policies. So we love Auntie Deb. She's doing an amazing job. We're really, really proud of her. But President Biden needs to be held accountable for not following through.
Sikanik Mopin, we're giving you the last word. You came down from Alaska, leading Indigenous rights activists at your young age. What do you take away from this week?
I take away knowing that this is not an isolated incident in Alaska where children are getting cancer, asthma, We are seeing our caribou with black bone marrow, with mold on our fish, and we come to our relatives, and the same things are happening in communities all over the world, and we are saying enough is enough, and standing with leadership with no leader, but an entire group of indigenous peoples and allies that are saying, expect us, because we have not been respected.
We thank you both for being with us. Sikanik Maupin is the Executive Director of the Sovereign Inupiat for the Living Arctic, and Joy Braun, member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, a frontline community organizer with the Indigenous Environmental Network, which has organized this historic civil disobedience in Washington that have lasted throughout the week. At this point, over 530 people have been arrested. Coming up, we look at the humanitarian crisis unfolding in the world's largest jail complex, right here in New York City, Rikers Island. Stay with us.
I have not come here alone. I carry my people in my bones. I have not come here alone. And if you listen, you can hear them in my soul.
You can know so many ways with that. I have not come here alone. I carry my people in my bones, yeah. I have not come here alone. If you listen, you can hear them in my song.
My soul.
I have not come here alone.
No.
I carry my people in my bones. I have not.
Never Alone by the Peace Poets. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to the humanitarian crisis unfolding in the world's largest jail complex, which is located right here in New York City, one of the world's richest cities. It's on an island in the middle of the East River between Queens and the Bronx. Most of the 5,700 people in the city's jails are held at Rikers Island. Most of them are awaiting trial. Amid skyrocketing violence, staffing shortages, chronic medical neglect, some are calling Rikers a death trap. So far this year, 12 people have died at Rikers and the city's jails, the most since 2016, including 5 suicides. Wilson Diaz-Guzman, Javier Velasco, Tomas Carlo Camacho, Brandon Rodriguez, Segundo Gualpa, Thomas Brownson III, Richard Blake, Jose Mejia Martinez, Robert Jackson, Asias Johnson, Kareem Isabdul, and Stephen Cadu. Last month, more than a dozen elected officials visited Rikers Island following reports of worsening conditions. This is New York Assembly member Jessica Gonzalez Rojas speaking after touring Rikers.
I am admittedly an emotional mess. I have 9 pages of mothers to call, of partners to call, of loved ones to call. Because people have been stuck inside for days, for weeks, for months without a court hearing. I just witnessed an attempted suicide. Miss, come here. Jumped up there and tried to hang themselves. Me and Senator Ramos were right there. Nobody deserves this.
Well, this week, New York Governor Kathy Hochul and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio announced they'll transfer most of the 230 women and transgender people held at Rikers to 2 state prisons, including the maximum security Bedford Hills prison. Again, most of them are awaiting trial. For more, we're joined by 3 guests. Anissa Sabur was formerly incarcerated at Rikers Island Jail and at Bedford Hills Prison, and is a leader with the Halt Solitary campaign. Julian Harris Calvin is director of the Greater Justice New York program at the Vera Institute of Justice. And Jumaane Williams is New York City's public advocate. Last month, he toured Rikers, which he's done since 2008. Welcome you all to Democracy Now! Jumaane, let's begin with you. You've said conditions the last time you toured Rikers Island Jail Complex were the most horrific you've seen. Tell us what you've seen.
At that point, it was just stunning. I honestly believe this country would invade another country to rescue people who were living in the conditions I saw. It was really very hard to explain unless you were there. People just laying in filth. There was one man in a cell that they called a cell, was actually a shower, couldn't sit, couldn't stand, couldn't lay down. I didn't know if it was urine or water that was keeping this person wet. They were just naked. I saw a cell that should have had 2 or 3 people with 6 people. They had a bag in which they were sharing as a bathroom because the toilet wasn't working. People who should have been moved within 24 hours were there 7, 8 days. There were HIV patients, mental health patients who hadn't gotten their medication in weeks. It was a disaster for everyone on both sides of those bars, and both of them are actually black and brown. I would point out, you mentioned that Rikers is the largest jail complex in the world, which sadly probably makes it the largest mental health institution in the world as well, which is a whole nother problem.
You've said you're concerned that Rikers could explode like Attica 50 years ago, 1971, when there was a prisoner uprising against the conditions there. And then the New York governor at the time, Rockefeller, called in the state troopers and they opened fire, killing scores of people.
At that moment, when we were there, I actually thought it was imminent, what we saw. There were people who are detained literally just walking around. We did have to see the emergency unit come more than once. We actually saw people who were housed there asking for additional correction officer support. That's how bad it had gotten. We saw one person who actually got out of his cell shower and was the one handing out the food that was there for some of the other people who couldn't get out. It was a complete disaster and a breakdown. And it was very hard to express that. And I wish the governor herself, actually, I think she should still tour. And the mayor, it's been a dereliction in duty. The small visit that he did make, he could have just done from his office, having spoken to no one. It's hard to explain unless you're there. And I'm sure our guest who's here could tell you even more firsthand.
Well, Anisa Sabur, I wanted to go to you next. You were imprisoned at Rikers and at the maximum security Bedford Hills. If you can respond to the new New York governor, Hochul, moving about 230 women and transgender prisoners from Rikers, we're talking about people who have not even been tried. I mean, the jail at Rikers is for what? Prisoners who are serving under a year prison sentence or are awaiting trial. They're there because they can't afford bail.
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me. And I just want to say this. First of all, the language is what have them doing what they're doing to people, right? They don't see detainees as people. And yes, I think the governor should have actually went in and spoken to those women and trans women and seen for herself the way the public advocate and other legislators did to see what the crisis is and really how to address it. Moving someone who has not had due process from a city jail where you're detained to a state sentence facility is traumatic. And I'm telling you, because I went through it, they did not move me before I was sentenced. I was detained at Rikers several times, right? But I was not moved to a state facility until I was state sentenced. The state is very different and operates very different from the city. The programming, the access, moving people away from the courts to be able to transport them. It's really hard to get back and forth to court from Rikers Island. Let me say that. In order for a person to get to court, they're woken up at 3 a.m. in the morning, fed a light breakfast, and put into a holding cell until whenever the bus arrives. Some folks don't get to court till noon because of the number of transportation buses that has to come and deliver them to the courts. So imagine being on Rikers in the city, which is just across the bridge from Manhattan, Queens, and the Bronx, where the courts are located, and now being sent to Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. The state has not done anything good for the people who are state sentenced. I can't imagine having to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning from Bedford Hills to be fed a light breakfast, to travel maybe 2.5, maybe 3 hours if you come from Staten Island to Westchester to get to court. How do your families get to you? Okay, she's going to provide free buses twice a day. People had access to Rikers all day. It was easy transportation. Now they have to travel to another location, get one bus, drive 2.5, maybe 3 hours to Bedford Hills. Who knows how long they're going to allow them to visit? Rikers visits were only 1 hour. The state visits are different, and they were only on the weekends, right? There's no programming in the state facilities right now due to COVID. So how are people going to actually be able to engage in some of the community resources that are out here for them to help them through their process before they get to court? Whether it's substance programming, whether it's mental health programming, all of these things are going to be missing now because it's a whole nother process to become a volunteer to bring your program into the state facilities. So this is what I would say to the governor. You need to rethink what you're doing. The traumatic impact that this would have on the lives of these individuals, their families, and their communities. It should not happen. It needs to stop now.
And let's be clear about the racial disparities here. The Sentencing Project just came out with their report, not only on what's happening in state prisons in New York, but around the country. It said black people are incarcerated in state prisons across the country at nearly 5 times the rate of whites.
And that's true. That is a true resource fact. Rikers Island is full of black and brown bodies, male, female, transgender, gender nonconforming, black and brown bodies from low-income communities in New York City. How do you take them out of the community that they are in and put them in a whole nother? Do you know the community and the income ratio in Westchester County where this prison is? I'm surprised it's even there. Bedford Hills is one of the richest counties in the state. So you're taking these people from these communities and putting them in these communities where nobody cares about them. Out of sight, out of mind. You know, people are saying they're going to do other things. They really want to look at what the governor's doing. It's getting them out of Rikers. But there are things in the community right here in New York City, organizations and resources that these women and trans women could have benefited from. The state has 3 facilities located in New York City that could have been transformed or repurposed to hold these women until something better could have came along. Why put unsentenced people in state facilities? Do you know the pressure that's going to have on the state correction officers and their union and the fight? How people are going to be neglected even more because they're not state sentenced? No programming. The medical in the state is just as bad. Have you seen the report that Center for Justice just did on the death of the elders in prison, 55 and over? Every 3 days, there's a death in one of New York State prison facilities. Human lives are being lost on a daily basis. So you tell me this is the best answer? I don't believe it.
I'm also thinking...
And I won't accept it.
I'm also thinking about Layleen Polenko, who died at Rikers in 2019. She was being held there, a transgender Afro-Latinx woman, being held at Rikers because she couldn't afford the $500 bail. She was put in solitary. She had epilepsy, and she died.
Mm-hmm. And I have been advocating with her sister to end solitary on Rikers. And this just seems like another one of the city and states shenanigans, right? Where they say, oh, we don't have solitary, we're ending it. But you're still building cages to put human beings in like they're animals, right? So you think the solution to a crisis in a horrific facility is to take the women and put them in another horrific facility, right, with no real access, is going to solve the problem. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound.
Let's bring in Julian Harris-Calvin. Can you talk about the role of bail, the role of prosecutors and judges in sending people to Rikers and releasing them from what is described as a hellhole? You're a former public defender.
Yes. Prosecutors and judges hold the keys to Rikers Island. They are the gatekeepers, and they determine who goes in and who comes out, because judges are the folks that send New Yorkers to Rikers Island and to any other jail facility in New York City. And the bail reform law that was passed in 2019 was responsive to exactly what Ms. Sabor was talking about, that, bail is something that rich people can pay and poor people can't pay. And poor Black and brown New Yorkers are the folks that have suffered from that. And so the bail reform law made it so that far fewer folks, mostly Black and brown folks, were being sent to a Rikers Island on unaffordable bail. But there still are scenarios in which judges can set bail, and they're often setting bail after there's a request by New York City district attorneys. And so the folks who are in Rikers Island, most of them, about 4,500 of them, are pretrial detainees. They're people who are held pretrial. They are innocent until proven guilty, but they're languishing in Rikers Island under these conditions simply because they cannot afford to pay their way out. And so what needs to happen, we need to focus on solutions. I think we have established that it is horrific on the island, that people are in conditions that sounds like it's some gulag that we've heard about from the Cold War, right? And what we need to focus on now are what are the solutions? And DAs and prosecutors are part of the solution. Prosecutors need to stop requesting bail. They need to stop requesting bail. If they don't request bail and judges release folks, then there are no more people being funneled in to this penal colony that is torturous. And judges need to stop being responsive to the bail request and actually setting bail. So that will stop the funnel on the front end. But we need to get people off the island. So judges and prosecutors and defense lawyers need to come together and make the decision that we are going to reassess all of the people who are on Rikers Island because they're there on bail. And we need to either lower bails and make them affordable, which is required by the bail law, or we need to just release them. There's no reason why people need to be sitting there dying. And in the conditions that the public advocate just mentioned and recounted, when there are other solutions and alternatives. There's mental health treatment in the community, which is better than the kinds of mental health treatment we're getting on Rikers Island. There are drug use treatment services. There are employment services. There are all kinds of programming and services that folks can access that are better for them, that are better for our communities off the island, and they can address some of the concerns that judges and prosecutors might have that are the basis for setting bail.
What about that place nicknamed The Boat, anchored off the Bronx's southern shore across from Rikers Island? I believe someone recently died there.
Yes, The Boat was supposed to be a temporary solution to the the stated need to have facilities for folks who are being held pretrial in the early 90s. And in the 90s, there were 20,000 people being incarcerated in New York City, and now we're just under 5,600. And the boat is a floating barge. It's literally a boat that they have converted into a jail. And when we say that we need to close Rikers Island and we need to get people off the island, that includes folks who are floating in the boat in the East River right off of Rikers Island. And the conditions there are similarly bad, and folks need to be taken off of the boat. What about
the media's constant repetition, Julian, that murder is up, crime is up, that something has to be done?
I think part of the reason why the jail population on Rikers Island increased about 40% between last summer, when we were at all-time lows of about 3,800 people, to about 6,000 people just a month ago, is because of this fear-mongering and inaccurate rhetoric around bail reform, criminal justice reform, vis-a-vis crime rates. We are not at all-time highs in terms of crime and public safety threats in New York City or New York State. Actually, we are on par with 2019's historic lows in terms of crime rates. But it is true, and I think we need to talk about and acknowledge that murders were up and shootings, gun crimes related to murders too, were up in 2020 and 2021 as compared to 2019's all-time lows. They're still far below what it was like in New York City in the 90s. And I'm sure my co-guests can recount what it was like in the 90s or even the early 2000s. So we are still at very low crime rates across crime categories. But it's true that in the last few years, gun crimes and murders have gone up compared to 2019 and 2018, which were very, very low. And so we need to address those. Again, this is about solutions. And what we know is throwing people in jail is not a long-term solution to gun crime and murders. In fact, we need to be taking our investments, some of the $2.5 billion we spend on the Department of Corrections and on jailing people on Rikers Island. We need to take a big chunk of that money, and we need to invest in evidence-based solutions to public safety issues. That means credible messengers and violence interrupters and the kinds of in-the-community programming where we've seen 86% drops in gun crimes and homicides in places like Richmond, California. We've seen it here in New York City in Crown Heights, where after credible messengers and violence interrupters went into the community, that they had lower rates in that community of gun crimes and shootings specifically, and shooting-related homicides as compared to the NYPD precinct adjacent to them.
We just have 30 seconds, but I wanted to go back to Jumaane Williams, the New York City public advocate. You formed an exploratory commission, an exploratory committee to run for governor. What would you do differently?
Well, to the conversation that's going on, we have to at once acknowledge spikes in crime, but we also need leaders who are going to guide New Yorkers through the facts of what's happening and not feed into the fear-mongering that was done 30 years ago when the crack epidemic happened and didn't actually solve the problem, and then people apologized 30 years later. When we look at where we were at 2018 and 2019, the same people then said we needed to lock up more black and brown people, even as we were at historic lows. I want to go back to 2010 and 2011 when we told folks, which is the numbers we're at about now, that we had better ways of dealing with this violence. And from 2010 to 2011 to 2018, we were fought all the way to becoming the safest city we had ever been and the safest in the nation.
We have to leave it there, but I want to thank you so much for being with us, and this conversation will continue. Jumaane Williams, New York City public advocate, considering a run for the New York governorship. I want to thank Anissa Sabur, who was formerly jailed at Rikers and Bedford Hills, and Julian Harris-Calvin, director of the Greater Justice New York program at the Vera Institute of Justice. As we move now to our final segment, this is Democracy Now! We end today's show looking at the ongoing protests that's taking taking place in New Jersey. The People's Organization for Progress, or POP, is leading a 67-mile march to the Capitol Trenton to demand the New Jersey legislature pass legislation to hold police accountable. The march began a week ago in Montclair, wraps up Saturday in Trenton. Joining us now from the side of the road is Larry Hamm, chair of the People's Organization for Progress. He's joining us on the road as he heads to Princeton for today's leg of the protest march. Can you talk about your demands, Larry?
Good morning, Amy, and thank you for having me on. Yes, this is the Long March for Justice, the March to Trenton for police accountability, for social justice and economic progress. We're marching to draw attention to the issue of police brutality, and we want the state legislature to pass Bill A4656, which is the Police Review Boards with Subpoena Power bill. We want that bill passed because that will enable municipalities to have police review boards with subpoena power, which the FOP and the police organizations have been fighting because they don't want civilian oversight. We're marching for an end to voter suppression. We support the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, but we also want same-day registration here in New Jersey. We're marching for reparations for African Americans for the enslavement of our ancestors. We're calling on the legislature to pass Bill A711, which would establish a reparations commission similar to H.R. 40, the national reparations bill in Congress, which we also support. And we're marching for economic progress. We feel that $7.25 federal minimum wage is a slave wage, and we want an immediate doubling of the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. And we also want free college for all young people and the abolition of student debt. Those are some of our demands.
What is the response of the governor, of the legislature?
Well, it's not been a great response from the legislature because the Police Review Boards bill, which is at the top of our list, has wound its way through the legislative process, was released from committee. The only thing remaining is for the Speaker of the Assembly to post it for a vote and the President of the Senate to post the Senate version S-2963 for a vote. They have refused to do so for months. After they post it for a vote, it then has to be signed by the governor. Now, this is interesting because it came up as an issue in the gubernatorial debate that was held just a couple of days ago. And the governor's response was not the strongest that we anticipated. And so this is why we're marching. We're marching to draw attention to the issue and to put the pressure on the state leadership to pass this bill, because police brutality is a real and serious problem here in the state of New Jersey.
The role of street protests. Larry, you ran against Cory Booker for senator in New Jersey, yet you remain now in the streets.
Well, absolutely, because we have to use all the methods that are available to us. Yes, I ran for U.S. Senate and got more than 118,000 votes statewide, and we think that was a good start, and we're going to build on that. But we know that electoral politics alone is not enough. In fact, the primary antidote to police brutality is the organized and mobilized people. This is why we have engaged in this 67-mile march through 27 towns over 9 days, which will end in Trenton tomorrow. And when this march is over, we will engage in other street activities, including the National Day Against Police Brutality. October 22nd, we're going to have a rally against Newark with the victims with the families of the victims murdered by the police.
And we will cover that as well. Larry Hamm, chair of the People's Organization for Progress, speaking to us from the road in New Jersey. That does it for our show. A very happy birthday to Democracy Now!'s Juan Gonzalez, and a happy first birthday to my precious pup, Zazu. She blew in on a nor'easter in December, reunited with her beloved twin brother Kasha at 4 months, and yesterday they came together again to celebrate their first birthday, dancing and prancing in Central Park. Happy birthday, Kasha and Zazu Goodpup. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is currently accepting applications for 2 positions, Director of Finance and Administration and a Human Resources Manager. Learn more and apply at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Produced with Renee Phelps, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Messiah Rhodes, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Terracena, Tammy Warnock, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alkoff, Tamar Yastu, Joe, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Massoud. Special thanks to Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman.